Okay, so I want to continue our discussion on culture in the ancient world, the rise of civilization. I want to look at some images here of landscape and the environment. There is a very close relationship between culture and understanding the environment, or the stories that are told in culture, the stories or images that show up in history or in myth, and its relationship to things that exist around a culture in the environment. So here's an image of Greek olive orchards. And it's important that we think about the amount of rain, if an environment is arid, what kinds of things grow there, and what kinds of things grow in one region that don't grow in another region. So there's some very practical understanding of the environment in terms of the sorts of things that can be sustained in one area and traded with another area, and vice versa. But also importantly, that the elements that are found within a surrounding city, within a surrounding region, not only does the environment show up in myths and stories about a particular culture, but also in terms of the religious tradition. People in ancient Samaria were polytheistic. There were all sorts of different gods. And to look at a kind of list of the various Sumerian gods or the Babylonian gods, they are, not surprisingly, all that different in many ways than the Greek pantheon of gods. And so again, one culture sort of evolves and borrows and is influenced by other cultures at the point of contact, as well as aspects of assimilation or empire building and things like that. Agricultural production in Egypt. This is obviously a more modern picture here. But gardens, I think, are an interesting aspect of culture, both in a practical sense and in a religious sense. And one of the first gardens that many of us might be familiar with is the discussion of the Garden of Eden in the Hebrew Bible, and how important and foundational it is as a space with all sorts of symbolic consequences about the figure of God mandating certain rules in the figure of Adam and Eve and transgressing, and how their transgression, again, this story being one of the foundational stories of Western thought and religious thought, about how their transgression both explains, I think, in a kind of mythic way, what was the punishment for Eve, that giving birth, going into labor was painful. So in thinking about that as a kind of, well, it is a story, whether you subscribe that it's a religious story or a literary story or whatnot, but it is a story that helps explain why women oftentimes experience a lot of pain in labor. What was Adam's punishment for transgression? Well, he had to get a job, he had to work, he had to farm, he had to be involved in agriculture. This then is symbolic of the rise of civilization. So the garden, both as a practical space, what is it that we can grow to sustain civilization, and as a symbolic space, which represents all sorts of things, is important both in thinking about Western thought today, by large numbers of people subscribing to the Judeo-Christian tradition, that this is a story of faith and theology, or just in terms of a story that emphasizes the symbolic nature of transgression, sin, redemption, so on and so forth, just to sort of simplify it. So the Garden of Eden, which shows up in the Hebrew Bible, this is thousands of years later from ancient Samaria, but an important place for us to think about. The Babylonian Garden, or the mythic Hanging Gardens of Babylon. A kind of paradise like the Garden of Eden, a place that perhaps humankind would like to return to, because civilization is fantastic, You have your iPhone, you can text your friends, you got your car, you can go to, well, there are places that you used to be able to go to that you can't go to now. But all of these things to make life easier, even for the ancient Sumerians and the ancient Babylonians. But even then, as now, life is tough. And so the garden, I would suggest to you, is kind of a centerpiece in the fantasy of civilization, a place to return to where things are much simpler. The world's first garden, possibly in Jericho in the Palestinian territories, roughly 9000 BCE, or the gardens at the House of Venus at Pompeii, is one of the older surviving gardens in the world at 700 BCE. So both religiously and culturally, and in the imagination, the garden, I think, occupies an important place. And then again, in terms of the division of labor, you know, you have certain people doing this and certain people engineering, certain people involved in agriculture. The garden later develops into a very specific representation of the things that are important to a particular culture. So here's an example of a Moorish garden. The Moorish garden, simply has water elements. Oftentimes it has fruit trees at the four corners, which may represent the various elements in the world. It could represent the various directions. It might represent the four seasons. So the garden itself becomes a kind of story that explains various aspects of culture and the things that are important to that culture. An example of an ancient Chinese garden. And what I find interesting as well is that if you were to look up ancient Chinese gardens or images of ancient Chinese gardens, what you often find are images that are Chinese gardens and Japanese gardens, as if there was no difference between Chinese gardens and Japanese gardens. And you know, this is sort of an aside, but I'm wondering if, as Westerners, that the algorithms that are employed by search engines, that Westerners think of the Japanese culture and the Chinese culture as simply one culture, that there are no differences between the two. So I think that's interesting and a little bit cautionary, that there are differences between Chinese gardens and Japanese gardens. They shouldn't all show up in a search together. But Chinese gardens, the various elements, the various plants may represent the larger field of nature. So bridges, for instance, in certain styles of Chinese gardens, bridges or stones may represent mountains and stories and myths that are told about the development of the world and humankind. Gardens are moral places. They are ethical places. And these various cultures, particularly here in this example, in Chinese gardens, they tell stories about morality and the development of culture in China. Greek garden, something more of us might be familiar with. Greek gardens are a later development towards the end of the first millennium BCE. Gardens that we might see that have a lot of statuary and gods and goddesses. They might be terraced, a lot of stonework, and so on and so forth. Okay, I think it's also worthwhile to look at the various representations of gods and goddesses as a kind of quick survey of how artists and priests imagined their various gods and goddesses, whether in sculpture and in murals, in various stonework, in capitals and things like that. So here's an image of Assyrian and Babylonian deities from 3100 to 500 BCE. The image over on my left-hand side is probably of Tiamat, the multi-headed dragon figure from Babylonian and Sumerian mythology. The figure over on my right has two deities. You'll notice that there's not a lot of detail, that these are highly stylized, and it's not because the artists did not have the ability to make these deities look like people. This was a conscious choice that these artists made to construct their understanding of their gods and goddesses. So they don't have a lot of detail, not a complicated image. The figures are facing outward. These are three-dimensional figures on a sculpture or a mural, but there's not a lot of relief here. It's almost a kind of two-dimensional figure. The bodies are not quite in proportion as well. As we move through time, the figures, I would argue here, begin to change. In ancient Egypt, we have a popular god here, the god of death, Anubis, who has a very human-like body and the head of a jackal. So this figure is, as we're slowly moving through time, again in different regions, different time evolutions, but this figure has, again, the body of a human and the head of a jackal here, but still stylized, not a lot of detail. Again, not because of the absence of imagination, but more so that this is how this god is imagined, that these gods are different from humans. But again, as we move further in time, in ancient Greece, 700 BCE to 200 BCE, the figures of gods and goddesses really start to take on a much more human morphology. And if you are familiar right now with some of the stories, some of the Greek stories, whether it's through the Iliad and the Odyssey, or the Metamorphosis or the Aeneid or whatnot, that these gods and goddesses interact with humans on a regular basis, often have the same sorts of vices that humans have, betrayals, the backstabbings, the sexual transgressions, all sorts of different things. And so I'm kind of wondering if, as these gods begin to evolve in their behavior, are they then imagined more to be like people, and sculpted and painted and all of those sorts of things to look more like us? And then by the time we get to the Common Era, the beginning of the Common Era, we have the figure of Jesus Christ. And here is an early image of Christ Pantocrator, in the 6th or 7th century. And this image is at St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt, which is Mount Sinai, in Mount Sinai today. And clearly from this image, the figure of Jesus looks very much like a person that interacted with people on a regular basis. Okay, so we're going to talk here about writing and its technology. And if you recall, there were other aspects to the rise, other aspects that were important to the rise of civilizations, including cities, agriculture, and local and regional trade. Writing is the fourth aspect and one of the most important technological advancements in the ancient world. Oftentimes we think of language, that we might attribute language to the ancient Phoenicians, that they created an alphabet that was then modified by the Greeks by adding vowels and so on and so forth, and we have a modern form of the alphabet, which then streamlined writing and language. And then that is part of the story. But the Phoenicians could not make their developments without the developments that were first constituted by the ancient Sumerians. So what is writing and how is it a technology? Writing was not invented for the purpose of preserving literature. The earliest written documents contain commercial, administrative, political, and legal information. So people didn't say, okay, I have all of these stories, why don't we write them down? In fact, the writing down of stories really appeared later. Many of these cultures, or all of these cultures in the earlier period, told stories orally. And so there are all sorts of oral devices that we would find in Gilgamesh, even in the Iliad and the Odyssey, although that's kind of a mimicry of the oral tradition as it was, for the most part, being written down. But you have, mnemonic devices. You have repetition that help people memorize things and sort of reinvigorate the audience in an oral telling. So the first areas that were used for literature, I should say, the first areas that were used for writing was to document transactions, to write laws down, for these various aspects that we need in civilization, that information could be codified, could be disseminated, and importantly, could be passed down through different generations. The oldest writing was pictographic. The sign for an object was written to resemble the object itself. So what did this mean? If you were referring to a water buffalo, you would write a picture, pictographic. So it would be a picture of a water buffalo, and that is what you were referring to. This was in many ways rudimentary. You could not write complex thoughts down. Later this developed into ideograms where you could write things with pictures that did not direct oneself to the actual object, not to a buffalo or to the sun. But an example might be a heart in our culture. A heart representing not that you have to go see your cardiologist, but rather the heart indicates a kind of abstract concept like love. So cultures borrowed from one another. Language eventually developed into signs. So signs were from sounds, words, and sentences. And we'll just take a quick look here at this. Cuneiform developed in the ancient world as a writing system. So cuneiform is not the language itself. There were handfuls of languages that use cuneiform. Cuneiform, cuni means wedge. So what these ancient peoples did, they took wet mud and they took reeds and they began to make marks. And scholars said it looked like wedges, and so they called it cuneiform. So cuneiform is not one language, it's handfuls of languages, maybe more than a dozen or so. And so one of the ways with which pictures developed into signs was in part because people are kind of lazy and the technology was limiting in a way that you couldn't do necessarily round shapes. So let's say the shape here of the sun, which is round, became more rectilinear, and in the third sort of transformation in this set of examples became rectangular with a wedge indentation in the middle. So on the far left-hand side, you may have a picture of an actual sun. Through various evolutions, the sun became a symbol which represented sun. And we can see here in the next example of mountain, that the mountain looks like perhaps an actual mountain, and when writing was used, when the mud was impressed with the reeds and these, it's more difficult to create all of these shapes. And it was faster to reduce the amount of detail, then the mountain was not depicted as a picture of a mountain, but became a symbol. Now in ancient Sumeria, they had thousands of different symbols, and through time and appropriation and borrowing and whatnot in different cultures, the number of signs began to be reduced, particularly when the more we move from pictogram to something that's more of a sign with signs that can be added together to create sentences. So begun around 2700 BCE, and various syllabaries were constructed around 2000 BCE. The first great heroic narrative of literature may be Gilgamesh. There are other literatures that are contemporary or nearly contemporary with Gilgamesh. The version that we typically read of Gilgamesh is not the earliest version, but a version that was written down much later. This nearly vanished when it wasn't translated from cuneiform into new modern alphabets. And here's just another example of some, actually these are pictograms. The rebus principle of written language, and the rebus principle as an important development. Add the sound of one picture to the sound of another picture. Now you have a word. And here's the sort of classic example. You have a picture of a bee. The word is bee. You have a picture of a tray. The word is tray. You are sort of taking the sound. You are separating the sound, the name of the thing from the thing itself, adding the sound that you've removed to another sound. Put those things together, now you have a concept such as betray. And this sort of illustrates the development here of language. Here's an example of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. When writing first began in the ancient world, writing went from the top down. People wrote from the top down. And they found that it was very, very easy with your hand to sort of mess up what you were working on. So at some point in time, probably in the end of the 3rd millennium, maybe in the 2nd millennium BCE, the page was turned and people began writing from left to right, and that allowed a little bit of the drawing of the characters of the words themselves, so your hand wouldn't move over the things that you had already written. And so it was preserved. And we'll call these tablets. And in Gilgamesh, you'll see that these are divided not by chapters, but by tablets. These were mud tablets that were written upon, and then they were baked. And so there was a technology about how to cure these mud tablets. Obviously, these mud tablets could be broken, and there are instances in Gilgamesh where various editors had bracketed some things or used some ellipsi to indicate that there are portions of the text that are missing. Otherwise, outside of a catastrophic fall or whatnot, these tablets could be preserved for long periods of time. And here I think is a good example of Sumerian cuneiform, where you can really see, think about the edge of a reed or a long grass sort of indenting the wet mud with these various wedges. Okay, that'll conclude parts 1 and part 2 of the introductory lecture to the ancient world. Thank you.